In the sweltering heat of the Nevada desert, under a sky ablaze with the colors of dawn, two ancient stories began to collide. This wasn't the Middle East, nor some distant land of biblical history. This was Silver Creek, a small rural town where faith and tradition were woven into every corner cafe conversation and every dusty roadside chapel. Ethan Carter, a 65-year-old retired history teacher, stood on the front porch of his farmhouse, staring at the cracked earth. His eyes, though faded with age, still burned with curiosity and conviction. Ethan wasn't just a local storyteller. He was known for delivering powerful Sunday school lessons at the nearby community church. But today, as he flipped through the worn pages of his old leather-bound Bible, something unsettled stirred deep within him. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest single-story home with clay-tiled roofing, lived Omar Rahman, a 60-year-old former journalist originally from Cairo. Omar had moved to the U.S. 3 decades ago, but his heart still carried the pulse of his Middle Eastern roots. On his bookshelf sat both the Quran and a translated copy of the Torah. Omar wasn't just a man of faith. He was a seeker of truth, a man wrestling with history, identity, and the echoes of ancient promises. The two men had known each other for years. They had shared coffee at the local diner, engaged in long debates at town hall meetings, and often locked horns over politics and religion. Ethan stood firm in his Christian beliefs, deeply tied to the story of Isaac. Omar, on the other hand, viewed the world through the lens of Ishmael's legacy. Their arguments often circled back to one burning question: why have Jews and Arabs, Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants, spent thousands of years embroiled in conflict? One particular Saturday morning, this question took center stage again. The town's small community center was hosting an interfaith dialogue, a gathering that attracted not only the Christian locals, but also Muslim families and curious onlookers from neighboring towns. Inside the dusty hall, chairs were set up in a large circle. Posters on the walls read phrases like "Unity through understanding" and "One God, many paths." Ethan arrived first, clutching his Bible close, while Omar walked in shortly after, Quran in hand. The moderator, a young woman named Sophia Martinez, opened the session with a soft yet powerful voice. Today, we're here to confront one of history's most complicated and painful questions. Why have these two families, descendants of Abraham, remained at odds for so long? Ethan was the first to speak. His voice trembled with both emotion and conviction. "It all started with a promise," he began, gesturing to the worn-out book in his hands. "God told Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. But that promise, it came with conflict, right from the start, right?" Omar adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. "But Ethan, from our perspective, Ishmael was not rejected. He was blessed. The Quran speaks of him as a prophet, a leader. We see him as the rightful heir in many ways. Your story is not the only version." The room grew silent as the weight of thousands of years of theological tension hung in the air. Sophia quickly intervened, sensing the rising temperature in the conversation. "Let's start at the beginning," she suggested. "Let's explore the human side of this story. Two brothers, both loved by their father, but both caught in a divine narrative bigger than themselves." Ethan nodded, opening his Bible to Genesis 21. Abraham was old, nearing 100. His wife Sarah, barren her whole life, had lost hope. Desperate, she told Abraham to have a child with Hagar, her Egyptian servant. That's how Ishmael was born. Omar interjected, "But remember, Hagar was more than just a servant. In Islamic tradition, she's revered as a woman of resilience and faith. She endured exile and loneliness, yet trusted in God." As Ethan continued, his voice grew softer, weighed down by the gravity of the tale. Omar's eyes glistened, memories of family hardships flashing through his mind. Stories passed down from generations of displacement, of starting over in foreign lands, of faith being the only anchor in turbulent times. Sophia, holding back tears, looked around the room. So we have two brothers, both sons of the same father, both loved, both promised something by God, yet their lives took radically different paths. The crowd was captivated. Some nodded in agreement, others sat in deep thought. A few whispered prayers under their breath. Outside, the Nevada sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the land, symbolic of the light and darkness woven into this ancient tale. And as the clock struck noon, one thing was clear to everyone in that room. This wasn't just a story from ancient texts. It was their story, too. The story of humanity's ongoing struggle to choose between division and reconciliation, hatred and hope. As the summer days grew longer in Silver Creek, the tension between Ethan and Omar became impossible to ignore. The interfaith dialogue from the community center lingered like smoke in the air, unresolved, thick with emotion. Neither man could stop replaying their words from that day. On a warm Friday evening, Ethan sat alone at the back porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the horizon turn gold. His wife Charlotte noticed his silence. "Are you still thinking about that discussion?" she asked gently. Ethan sighed deeply. "It's more than just a discussion, Charlotte. It's like the story of Isaac and Ishmael is playing out again, right here, right now, between me and Omar. Two men, two truths, both believing they're right." Meanwhile, across town, Omar sat on a prayer mat reciting verses from the Quran. His granddaughter Layla tiptoed into the room. "Grandpa, why are people always fighting about who God loves more?" she asked innocently. Omar's heart sunk. How could he explain centuries of history to a child still learning to tie her shoes? He pulled her into his arms, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "It started a long time ago, sweetheart. A story about two brothers and a misunderstanding that never healed." That night, unable to sleep, Ethan grabbed his Bible and began reading again. Genesis 21. The words hit him harder than ever. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." His heart tightened. He imagined the scene. Abraham standing at the edge of the desert, watching Hagar and Ishmael fade into the horizon, bread and water barely enough to sustain them. What must Abraham have felt? The agony of choosing between sons? Omar's expression softened. "You think I don't understand Abraham's pain? My grandfather told me stories of when our family fled Cairo during political turmoil, packing everything we had in 2 suitcases, leaving behind our home, just like Hagar and Ishmael walked into the desert with nothing but faith." Ethan nodded slowly. "But that's just it. History keeps repeating itself. Expulsion, exile, fear, and pride. Always pride." The conversation grew heavier as Ethan took a deep breath. "You know what else struck me? The meaning behind Ishmael's name. God hears. Even in the wilderness, when Hagar cried, God heard her. He promised to make Ishmael a great nation. That's not rejection. That's love." Omar's eyes glistened. "And yet," he whispered, "your people say the covenant was only with Isaac." Ethan paused, realizing the delicate line he was walking. "Yes, but does that mean God's love stopped with Isaac? No, it doesn't. The blessing for Ishmael is still real, still unfolding. Look at the Arab nations today, powerful, resilient, full of rich culture and history." Omar looked toward the sky, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yet we're still divided, still bleeding." Ethan stepped closer. "Because we never dealt with the original wound, the family fracture. The brothers were torn apart, and their descendants inherited that pain." Silence fell over the bridge. A few birds chirped nearby, as if trying to break the heaviness. Omar finally spoke. "Do you know, Ethan, that in our tradition, we believe Ishmael was the son Abraham almost sacrificed?" Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "What?" "Yes," Omar said. "In Islam, the Quran doesn't name the son, but scholars have long believed it was Ishmael. That moment defines our faith. Being the chosen sacrifice, it's about honor, devotion, ultimate submission." Ethan's heart raced. For decades, he'd taught that event as Isaac's defining moment. The realization of how two faiths could tell the same story so differently left him stunned. Omar continued, "Maybe, just maybe, the biggest mistake we've made is thinking there can only be one truth." Ethan took a step back, absorbing the weight of those words. The idea felt both dangerous and strangely liberating. Before parting ways, Ethan reached into his pocket and handed Omar a small, worn stone he had found years ago near a riverbed, a symbol of peace he kept for moments like this. Omar closed his fingers around it. Their eyes locked, both men realizing this wasn't the end of their conversations, but perhaps the beginning of something new. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the bridge, both men walked away, still divided by belief, but united by something deeper, the aching desire for peace. Little did they know, the true test of their friendship and their faith was still to come. 2 weeks had passed since Ethan and Omar's tense conversation on the bridge. Both men went back to their routines, but a silent unrest lingered. Ethan threw himself into teaching Bible study classes at the local church, while Omar hosted community dialogue sessions at the town library. Though they had found some emotional common ground, the cracks between them hadn't truly healed. Then came the day that shook Silver Creek to its core. It was a clear Sunday afternoon. The town's small interfaith center, a place that had stood for years as a fragile symbol of coexistence, was hosting a joint charity event. The hall was filled with people, Muslims, Christians, atheists, agnostics, all united by one goal: raising funds for families affected by recent wildfires in the region. Ethan had agreed to open the event with a short prayer, while Omar was scheduled to give closing remarks. They stood on opposite ends of the hall, stealing occasional glances but avoiding direct conversation. As the event progressed, the atmosphere grew warm with community spirit. Children ran between tables, neighbors exchanged smiles, and donation jars filled quickly. But amid the joy, trouble was brewing. In the back corner of the hall, a heated argument erupted between two young men. One was Benjamin, a fiery 25-year-old who had grown up under Ethan's mentorship in the church. The other was Yusuf, Omar's nephew, visiting from Chicago. What began as a light debate over Middle Eastern history escalated with alarming speed. "You people always rewrite history," Benjamin shouted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "And you people always play the victim," Yusuf fired back, his fists clenched. All conversations stopped. Heads turned, parents pulled their children close. Ethan and Omar froze in place, their eyes locking across the room as realization sunk in. This wasn't just a personal quarrel. This was the ghost of Isaac and Ishmael manifesting right in front of them. Benjamin shoved Yusuf. The scuffle escalated in seconds. Chairs toppled, a table full of baked goods crashed to the floor. Without hesitation, Ethan sprinted toward Benjamin, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Stop! This isn't the way!" Simultaneously, Omar lunged for Yusuf, pulling him back with surprising strength for a man of his age. "Enough! This ends now!" The hall descended into chaos. Several guests began to shout, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Others ushered their kids out the doors. Sophia Martinez, the event coordinator, grabbed the microphone and begged for calm, but the damage was done. The fragile peace Silver Creek had nurtured for years shattered like glass underfoot. The local sheriff arrived within minutes. Deputies separated the crowd, took statements, and escorted both young men out of the building. No arrests were made, but the event was over.
Later that evening, as the town tried to process what had happened, Ethan sat on the church steps, head in his hands. Guilt gnawed at him. He wondered if his teachings, his passion for explaining Israel's right to the land, for defending Isaac's story, had planted seeds of intolerance in Benjamin. Meanwhile, Omar sat alone in his living room staring at the ceiling. He felt equally torn. Had his fiery discussions about oppression and historical wrongs unknowingly fueled Yusuf's anger? Just before midnight, Charlotte found Ethan still sitting outside. "You can't carry this alone," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Across town, Layla curled next to Omar on the couch. "Grandpa, will people hate each other forever?" she asked, her voice trembling. Omar swallowed hard. "I hope not, sweetheart. I truly hope not." The next morning, headlines from local online news outlets screamed, "Faith-based charity event erupts in violence. Religious tensions boil over in Silver Creek." Social media feeds filled with angry comments, conspiracy theories, and calls for action. Some blamed the church, others pointed fingers at the Muslim community center. Leaders from both sides scrambled for damage control. Meetings were scheduled, apologies drafted, statements prepared for the press. But behind the public relations crisis lay a deeper wound, one neither Ethan nor Omar could ignore anymore. The final blow came when Sophia called both men. "I hate to say this," she said, her voice trembling, "but the city council is considering shutting down the Interfaith Center. They're saying we've become a risk, a liability." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Omar's heart sank. The bridge between their communities, both literal and symbolic, was on the verge of collapse. As the sun set that evening, both men, sitting in their respective homes, knew what they had to do next. Not for pride, not for their version of truth, but for the future of Silver Creek, and for the next generation, like Layla and Benjamin, who deserved a world better than the one their ancestors had handed down. A storm had come, but sometimes only after the storm could new ground be broken for peace to take root. And for Ethan and Omar, the hardest conversations were still ahead. The air in Silver Creek remained heavy with tension. For days after the violent outbreak at the charity event, the streets were quieter, the local diner less crowded, and people avoided eye contact when crossing paths. Rumors swirled faster than the desert wind.
Ethan sat in his study, staring at a faded photograph on the wall, one taken decades earlier during his first trip to Jerusalem. Back then, standing at the Western Wall, he had felt close to God, sure of his understanding of history, faith, and his place in the world. But now, that certainty felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Charlotte found him tracing the edges of the photo frame with trembling fingers. "You're not yourself," she said softly. "I've spent my whole life teaching about God's chosen people," Ethan murmured. "About Isaac, about the covenant, about what that meant for history. But now, I wonder, have I been teaching history or feeding division?" At the same time, across town, Omar was in his garden, pulling weeds with unnecessary force. Lila watched him from the porch, concerned. Her innocent questions still echoed in his ears. "Grandpa, will people hate each other forever?" Omar had always prided himself on being a voice for justice, advocating for the oppressed. But now, replaying Yusuf's violent outburst in his mind, he couldn't ignore the possibility that he too had played a part in keeping old wounds open. On a restless Thursday morning, both men made the same decision without knowing the other had done the same. They needed to confront their own blind spots. Ethan walked into the town library, heading straight to the history section. For the first time, he picked up books about Palestinian displacement, Islamic history, and the Arab perspective on the Abrahamic story. As he flipped through pages filled with narratives he had never been willing to accept before, a painful realization settled in. Truth was more layered than he had allowed himself to believe. Meanwhile, Omar dusted off an old copy of the Torah that had been gifted to him by a Jewish professor years ago.
He sat on the couch, Lila curled next to him, and began reading passages about Isaac, not with a goal to refute, but to understand. For both men, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, daring themselves to jump into unfamiliar waters. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove past Omar's house, his heart pounding. Before he could change his mind, he pulled into the driveway and knocked on the door. Omar opened it, surprise flashing across his face. "I was just about to call you," Omar said. "Funny," Ethan replied with a sheepish smile. "I was thinking the same thing." They sat at the kitchen table, tension still present, but softer now, like a distant echo rather than a present threat. "I've been doing some reading," Ethan began, "and I never realized how much pain your people carry. The loss, the sense of exile. I never let myself see it before." Omar nodded slowly. "And I've been reading about Isaac, about the covenant. I always saw it as favoritism, as exclusion. But I'm beginning to see it more as a responsibility, a burden as much as a blessing." The two men sat in silence, letting the weight of their confessions hang between them. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "You know, in all the years I've preached about peace, I never thought about how much pride I carried. It was always about being right, defending history, proving a point." Omar chuckled bitterly. "I know that feeling. Always fighting to make sure Ishmael's story didn't get erased. Always afraid that if I softened, I'd betray generations before me." They exchanged a look, one of mutual exhaustion, but also recognition. "There's a verse I came across." Ethan flipped open his Bible to Ephesians 2:14. "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." Omar nodded. "And the Quran says, 'And do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, that is nearer to righteousness.'" For the first time in years, they smiled at the same time. That afternoon, they did something unexpected. Together, they drove to the community theater, now closed and surrounded by yellow caution tape. Standing on the steps, Ethan pulled out a marker from his pocket and scribbled on the boarded-up door, "Two brothers can still build something new." Omar pulled out his phone, took a picture of the message, and posted it with the caption, "This is where healing starts." By sunset, both men knew their friendship and their perspectives had forever changed. But more importantly, they realized their story wasn't just about Isaac and Ishmael anymore. It was about them. Two men, two faiths, two paths, finding a third way: understanding. The following week, Silver Creek experienced something it hadn't seen in years, a wave of community action, fueled not by anger, but by hope. After their conversation on Omar's porch, Ethan and Omar met daily. Gone were the days of defensive debates and theological point scoring. Instead, their meetings became brainstorming sessions for something new, something radical, a community-wide reconciliation event. On a Tuesday afternoon, they sat together at the corner table of Rosie's Diner, the unofficial heart of Silver Creek gossip. Spread across the table were handwritten notes, crumpled napkins with scribbled ideas, and half-empty coffee cups. "I'm thinking we call it the Brothers Gathering," Ethan said, tapping his pen against the table. "A reference to Isaac and Ishmael, but also us." Omar chuckled bitterly. "Poetic. But if you suggest we hold hands and sing Kumbaya, I'm walking out right now." They both laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks. Within days, flyers went up around town. Social media posts spread the word: the Brothers Gathering, a day of healing and honest conversation. All faiths, all backgrounds, no politics, just people. Some people rolled their eyes, others muttered that it wouldn't work, but surprisingly, many more signed up to attend. Curiosity was a powerful thing, and after the charity event disaster, people longed for something, anything that could break the tension. On the morning of the event, the town's old community theater, closed for renovations for a year, was reopened for this special occasion. The air inside smelled of fresh paint and old wood, but no one seemed to mind. Ethan stood on the makeshift stage, heart pounding. Beside him, Omar adjusted the microphone stand. Behind them, a simple banner stretched across the wall. One town, two stories, one hope. The room slowly filled, local business owners, teenagers, parents, grandparents. Even Sophia, who hadn't stopped crying since the last event, stood near the entrance handing out programs with trembling hands. Ethan took a deep breath and began. I've spent my life telling people that being right was the most important thing. But in the past few weeks, I've learned that being kind, being willing to listen, might matter more. He paused, scanning the audience. This isn't about converting anyone. It's about acknowledging that pain lives on both sides of every story. Omar stepped forward next, his voice deep and unwavering. I grew up believing my people were always the victims, always the wronged. And while there's truth in that, I realize now that focusing only on our wounds blinds us to the pain of others. He glanced at Ethan. Two narratives, both valid, both human.
People shared memories of migration, of family members lost in wars, of growing up under prejudice. Others spoke of spiritual journeys, moments of doubt, and the struggle to reconcile love for their faith with anger towards injustice. One young Jewish woman named Rachel stood up and tearfully recounted how her grandfather survived persecution in Eastern Europe, making his way to Israel for safety. Moments later, an elderly Palestinian man named Mahmoud shared how his family was displaced from their village in 1948, carrying only the clothes on their backs. For the first time, stories weren't told to compete, but to connect. At one point, Benjamin and Yusuf, the very two young men whose fight had triggered the crisis, stood awkwardly beside each other. After a long, tense pause, Benjamin muttered, "I guess I didn't really know what your family went through." Yusuf, clearly uncomfortable but honest, replied, "And I never thought about how your people feel about survival and identity." The handshake that followed wasn't perfect. It wasn't magic, but it was real. As the sun dipped low, Omar and Ethan stood outside the theater, watching people linger in the parking lot, deep in conversation, some exchanging phone numbers, others planning follow-up meetings. Charlotte walked up, smiling. "You did it," she whispered to Ethan. Layla tugged at Omar's sleeve. "Grandpa, is this what peace looks like?" Omar kneeled to her level, eyes misty. "Maybe it's the first step," he said, hugging her tight. Before leaving, Sophia approached both men with a grin. "City Council called. They're reconsidering the closure of the Interfaith Center. Looks like you've given them hope." That night, as Ethan sat on his porch staring at the stars, and Omar lit a candle in his living room, both men felt something shift deep inside. They had seen what was possible when walls came down, not just physical walls, but the harder ones, walls of pride, fear, and old wounds. And for the first time in a long time, they dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, this small town could show the world what reconciliation really looked like. Weeks passed, and what had started as a single community event was now growing into something much larger. Silver Creek, once known mostly for its antique shops and cattle ranches, was slowly gaining attention from nearby towns for something entirely different: its grassroots movement toward faith-based reconciliation. For Ethan, the change wasn't just happening in town, it was happening deep within himself. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan stood in his study, staring at the shelves that once had been filled with books arguing for religious superiority. He grabbed a stack of outdated theology books and with a long sigh placed them in a donation box. Charlotte walked in, raising an eyebrow. "Spring cleaning in the middle of fall?" Ethan smiled wryly. "More like heart cleaning." He realized how much of his life had been spent proving others wrong rather than building bridges. Now, each day felt like peeling back another layer of pride, exposing parts of himself he hadn't faced in decades. At the same time, Omar's journey was equally profound. One afternoon, Layla found him sketching in a worn notebook. "Grandpa, what are you drawing?" she asked, peeking over his shoulder. "It's an idea," Omar said softly. On the page were rough outlines of two hands reaching towards each other with a single olive branch in between. For years, Omar had written op-eds, attended protests, and given speeches focusing on historical injustice. But now, for the first time, he was thinking about solutions, not in policy terms, but in human terms. The town council approached both men, inviting them to co-lead a new initiative, the Silver Creek Reconciliation Project. Their first task was daunting, organizing a youth exchange between churches and the mosque from the neighboring city. Ethan wasn't sure how the younger generation would react. Memories of Benjamin and Yusuf's fight still haunted him. The day the kids arrived, Ethan stood nervously near the community center entrance. A group of Muslim teens from the city stepped off a bus, looking skeptical. Local Christian teens waited nearby, equally unsure. Omar gave Ethan a reassuring nod. "We're planting seeds, my friend, not expecting a full harvest in a day." To break the ice, they started with something simple: food. Long tables were set up outdoors, filled with dishes from both cultures: falafel, brisket, hummus, mashed potatoes, baklava, and apple pie. Over shared bites and hesitant smiles, barriers began to lower. By sunset, laughter echoed through the courtyard as kids played soccer together. Later that evening, Ethan stood by the refreshment table when Benjamin approached him. "Mr. Carter," Benjamin began, scratching the back of his neck, "I've been thinking about everything. The fight, your sermons, this whole thing. I guess I never realized how much anger I was carrying." Ethan placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Neither did I, Ben. Neither did I." On the other side of the courtyard, Yusuf sat with Layla and a few other teens, recounting stories of his family's move from Chicago and how difficult it was to feel accepted anywhere. Omar watched quietly from afar, heart swelling with cautious hope. But true growth isn't without setbacks. During a group discussion session, one student bluntly asked, "Why should we forgive people who hurt us?" The room went silent. Ethan stepped forward first. Forgiveness isn't about ignoring pain. It's about refusing to let that pain control the rest of your life. Omar added, "And understanding that sometimes we've hurt others too, even if we didn't mean to." The honesty in their voices disarmed the room. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Omar traveled together to nearby schools and faith centers, sharing Silver Creek's story. Media outlets began picking up the narrative, dubbing them the unlikely brothers of Silver Creek. What surprised them both was how much their own friendship deepened. One chilly evening, after yet another successful town hall meeting, Ethan and Omar sat together on the steps of the old theater, sipping hot tea. "You know," Omar said, gazing at the star-studded sky, "if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here with you, I would have laughed." Ethan chuckled. "Same here. Guess God has a strange sense of humor." They sat in silence for a while, watching the town below come alive with small signs of healing. Neighbors chatting who hadn't spoken in years, kids from different faiths walking home together, and porch lights staying on just a little longer at night. Ethan turned to Omar, voice thick with emotion.
We still have a long way to go, but for the first time, I'm not afraid of the journey." Omar nodded, raising his teacup for a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. "To new beginnings," Ethan echoed. And as the night deepened, both men sat quietly. Two old warriors, finally laying down their swords and picking up something far more powerful: understanding. The sun set slowly over Silver Creek, casting a golden glow over the hills and dusty streets. For most people, it was just another evening, but for Ethan and Omar, it marked something far greater, a milestone in a journey neither had expected to take. The town's community center, once boarded up and threatened with permanent closure, now stood newly renovated. Fresh paint, new windows, and a small garden filled with olive trees and desert roses lined the front walkway, a living symbol of hope and rebirth.
Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Tonight's event was the biggest the town had ever seen, the legacy of brotherhood, a celebration of unity and the progress Silver Creek had made. Local news reporters set up their cameras near the entrance. Representatives from both Christian and Muslim organizations traveled from nearby cities just to witness the event. Even the mayor, who had once doubted the project, was now seated front row, applauding the community's efforts. Ethan stood backstage, straightening his tie nervously. His hands shook, not from fear of public speaking, but from the overwhelming realization of how far he'd come. Charlotte squeezed his hand. "You're doing something historic, Ethan," she whispered. Across the room, Omar helped Lila adjust her new dress. She was scheduled to give the opening remarks, a role she had begged for after watching her grandfather work tirelessly for weeks. "Ready, Grandpa?" she asked with a grin. "More ready than I've ever been," Omar said, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. As the audience settled, Lila stepped up to the microphone. Her small voice rang clear and strong. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Lila Rahman, and tonight we're not here as Jews, Christians, or Muslims. We're here as family." The room erupted in applause. Ethan took the stage next. His speech wasn't rehearsed, it came straight from the heart. "I used to think reconciliation was impossible," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "I believed history was too heavy, that our stories were too different, our wounds too deep." He paused, scanning the audience, many of whom he had known for years. But something changed. I stopped trying to win arguments and started listening to the pain behind the words. He turned to Omar, locking eyes with his friend. "And I realized that peace starts with two people willing to have one difficult conversation at a time." Omar stepped forward, emotion thick in his voice. "I spent my life believing I had to fight to keep my story alive, but today I realize that sharing my story doesn't mean silencing yours." He pointed toward the back wall, where a new mural had just been unveiled that morning. It depicted two olive trees growing side by side, roots intertwined beneath the soil, though their branches reached in different directions. "The roots are our shared history. The branches are separate journeys, and yet both reaching for the same sun." The audience fell silent, many wiping away tears. Suddenly, from the back of the room, Benjamin and Yusuf, standing side by side, raised their hands for attention. We have something to say," Benjamin stammered. Yusuf nodded. "We want to apologize, not just to each other, but to all of you. We let our anger speak louder than our hearts. But we've been meeting every week since then, and we're working on a joint youth project now." The room burst into applause again, but this time louder, more sustained. As the event drew to a close, everyone stood together for a final group photo, one destined to hang on the community center's wall for generations to come. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed, Ethan and Omar sat alone on the steps outside the center, gazing up at the stars. "You know what's funny?" Ethan mused.
For all the years I spent studying Isaac and Ishmael, I never once imagined I'd see their story in us. Omar smiled, his eyes soft with gratitude. Maybe that's the point. Their story wasn't meant to stay in ancient texts. It was meant to be lived, healed, and rewritten generation after generation. Ethan nodded, and maybe, just maybe, Silver Creek gets to be the place where that healing begins. They sat in comfortable silence, two old friends, two spiritual brothers, watching the night sky, with hearts full of something neither of them had dared to believe in before: hope. The town had changed. They had changed. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. As the lights dimmed in Silver Creek's community center and people made their way home, Ethan remained seated in the front row, staring at the empty stage where hours earlier voices of hope had echoed through the room. His mind drifted back to the beginning of this journey, the arguments, the tension, the years of silence between communities that lived just blocks apart. The realization settled deep within him. Division wasn't the legacy Abraham intended for his sons. For generations, people had stood on opposite sides of history, holding tightly to their narratives like shields. Ethan understood now that while history mattered, it didn't have to dictate the future. Across town, Omar sat on his porch, sipping mint tea as Lila slept soundly inside. He thought about all the years he had spent fighting for recognition, defending Ishmael's story at every turn. But tonight, for the first time, he felt something shift inside. He no longer saw reconciliation as surrender, but as strength. The greatest lesson both men learned was painfully simple, yet deeply profound. Understanding someone else's story doesn't erase your own. It enriches it. Too often, we build walls, mental, emotional, even spiritual, because we fear that opening our hearts to another's pain will invalidate our own. But what Ethan and Omar discovered was that true healing happens when both sides lay down their weapons of pride and self-righteousness. They learned that being right doesn't always bring peace, but being compassionate almost always does. They realized that forgiveness isn't about forgetting historical wrongs. It's about choosing not to let those wrongs poison the present and future. Their journey taught them that two people with radically different beliefs could still build something beautiful together. And most importantly, they understood that conflict doesn't start with armies or governments. It starts in living rooms, in conversations over coffee, in small, quiet moments when one person decides to listen instead of argue. Both men also came to appreciate that reconciliation isn't a destination, it's a daily choice, a lifelong commitment to empathy, humility, and hope. Their friendship became a living example of what's possible when people dare to believe that healing is greater than hate. Ethan's final journal entry that night captured the lesson perfectly. Two brothers were separated by history, but reunited by love. If we can do it here, it can happen anywhere. Though Ethan and Omar's journey took place in a small American town, the lesson echoes across the world. We see similar divisions in cities, countries, and families everywhere. Conflicts fueled by politics, religion, race, or old generational wounds. So what can we take from Silver Creek? Start with one conversation. Find someone whose views challenge you. Invite them for coffee. Listen, not to reply, but to understand. Acknowledge pain on both sides. Every community, every person carries their own wounds. Recognizing someone else's doesn't diminish yours. Focus on shared humanity. Labels divide us. Empathy unites us. At the end of the day, we all want safety, love, and peace for our families. Take small actions, whether it's attending an interfaith event, volunteering with diverse groups, or simply speaking kindly to someone different from you. Small steps create big change over time. Be patient. Reconciliation isn't a single event, it's a process. Expect setbacks, but don't give up. If Silver Creek, a town once on the brink of collapse, could find healing, so can we. And maybe, just maybe, our generation will be the one that finally writes a new ending to the ancient story of division.